Today I'm going to talk about heroes and the search for transcendence. So we'll get to that passage in a bit. But who is your hero? Or do you have a hero even? Maybe you can think of a fictional character, someone from the movies, or a novel if you're a novel reader. Maybe a real life hero, someone who maybe in politics or humanitarian work or sports or something is your hero. People love heroes. Superhero movies have been a huge success for the last decade or so. And I'm a big fan of superheroes. When I was a kid, I was really into superhero comics and saved a whole bunch of them till I was older even. But I used to stay up late at night reading them all the time. And Spider-Man was my favorite, I confess. He was the best because he inspired me, because he was this kind of nerdy kid who wasn't popular. He gets these superpowers, and he doesn't use it to become the coolest kid in town, but instead he takes it seriously that he has to help others. There's this responsibility that came with the power. So that's what made him a hero, and I found him inspiring. It seems it doesn't even matter if a hero you have is fictional or real life. They can still be inspiring. The values they embody, the emotions they evoke, all seem to resonate with people at a deep level. And at some deep level, we all yearn for meaning in life, or something to transcend the mundaneness of our existence. Humans seek transcendence, a search for something beyond our material existence, something beyond our five senses. So today I'm going to suggest that our attitude towards heroes might have something to do with this search for transcendence. So my wife and I have two kids. It's getting pretty serious with me and my wife. We have two kids now. And one just turned 16 in September, Kayam, my oldest son. And for his birthday, every year I try and take him out on their birthday for lunch. And he's in high school. He doesn't want to be away from school very much. He's very studious. So it had to be a quick lunch. He chose McDonald's, which of course shows the kid in him still. But we went to McDonald's, and when we were at lunch, I asked him, I said, who do you want to be? Who do you want to be? Now, might have a slide. And he looked a little confused, I could tell. He was kind of like, well, I'm not really sure what I'm going to do. You know, he's thinking of being a teacher or a lawyer. He's not sure what he's going to. And I said, no, not what you're going to do. Who you want to be? And he said, I've never actually thought of that before. Never thought of it before. He's a bit confused. And I think that's common. We often conflate what we do with who we are or who we want to be. When we ask ourselves who we want to be, we are thinking about character traits that we aspire to. And where do these character traits come from? Well, they don't just magically appear out of nowhere. You actually observe them in someone and you try and emulate them or adopt them. I'm from Western Canada. My wife is too. Grew up in BC. Our kids have only known Ontario. We were actually living in Toronto as I was doing my PhD when my wife got pregnant, but we moved out west to have the kids. Didn't want them born out here. Didn't need them growing up thinking they were better than me. But anyway, I grew up in BC. And usually when people hear that I'm from BC, they think of the beautiful ocean, Vancouver, Victoria, all these beautiful places. I grew up in a small town called Quesnel. It's this dingy little town in kind of northern BC. Has more in common probably with small towns in Alberta than Vancouver, that's for sure. And it was a small town. It got cold. It had a really long winter every year. So that was my growing up. Growing up in that town, my father emphasized the value of hard work, and I should earn my own money. And so I worked a lot of different jobs during high school. And when I finished high school, I got on at one of the local mills. There's about 7 mills in my little town, and I got on a plywood plant. And I was kind of excited about it because they paid $16 an hour back when minimum wage was $4.75. So I was going to make big money. So I ended up working on what they call the green chain. The green chain in a plywood plant is they bring these big logs in, and they have this lathe that kind of is like a potato peeler and peels the logs into these long sheets, and they chop into wood. And on this conveyor belt, I'd stand at this conveyor belt all day, and I'd pull the wood off and stack it all day long, 8 hours a day. And That's what I did mostly at the mill, among other jobs. But this guy I worked with, he was called the head chain. He's the guy who stays at the front the whole day. The rest of us, there's two others on it. We rotate, we take turns because the front is the heaviest stacking. And this guy was as strong as a horse. He was a tough guy, but he had the respect of everybody at the mill. You could tell in the coffee room or wherever he was. He could take a joke. He didn't overreact to things. He wasn't a jerk. Working there, I kind of ended up looking up to him. And I'd never really thought about it consciously at the time, but I wanted to be like him in some ways. I was only 17, out of high school, and I kind of looked up to this guy. Part of me wanted to be like this guy, the head chain guy. Well, who do you want to be? Where do you get these character traits from that you might aspire to, desirable character traits? Well, consciously or not, you probably see them in other people and maybe even adopt them as heroes. I think I have a slide. Scott T. Allison and George Goethals in their book, Heroes, What They Do and Why We Need Them. They talk about how human beings have mental images or models of heroes. In psychology, these mental models or images are called archetypes or schemas. The basic idea is that we all have an idea of what a hero is or looks like. And that heroes are important. Heroes shape us. They give us what we need. There's this underlying human need to see the best of human nature, something to aspire to. You know, sometimes businesses bring in an external speaker to kind of motivate the workers, right? You know, they might bring in, say, I think I have a slide. They bring in some guy who climbed Mount Everest, say, and he comes in to speak to everybody to get them going, you know, because it's totally relatable. So this guy climbed Mount Everest, and now he's coming in. He's going to talk to these people who are trying to park as close as they can to the building. And they're like, this is the guy who's going to get us going. And then so this thing would be like, what's your Everest? You know, what's your toughest thing in life? And keep in mind his is Everest. So what are you going to say? You know, you might be like, oh, I don't know about you, but I have a hard time not binge watching Netflix. You know, I'm not sure how long you're up in the mountain. It's 24 hours a day. It's tough. It's tough. But why do they do that kind of thing? It seems unrelatable. But the reason they bring in some kind of motivational speaker is something in their story reveals character traits or their determination or something that can potentially inspire someone in a completely different field. And heroes model character traits, challenge us to rise to their level in some ways. They can inspire us to aim higher. So who's your hero? It doesn't mean you have to have a singular hero or an actual real life person that you completely model or want to emulate. Everybody has sinned, fallen short of God's glory. So there's no perfect heroes out there. Idolizing a particular person will lead to disappointment or disenchantment. That guy on the green chain when I was 17 who I looked up to, I didn't want to be that guy. You know, he was in his 30s and divorced, and I didn't want his life. I didn't want to be him, but something about him I wanted to emulate. There was an aspect to him. You know, they've told stories about heroes for millennia, of course. Back in Greek literature, you have stories of gods that are heroes. Some of them aren't very good even, but you can learn from those examples too. Hero archetypes can teach us lessons, whether they're real or imaginary people. And the Bible is full of heroes. And David is one of those heroes, who I'm going to talk a bit about today. It was great you read those passages from the Hall of Heroes in Hebrews. Lots of heroes. Well, it seems to me that God knows that heroes matter. Without the human characters, just commands and rules or superficial structures. Stories let us learn from heroes, create some shared experience that we can emulate. I mean, you know, the Torah, the first 5 books in the Old Testament, it's Torah, it's law, it's teaching, but it's not just laws. There's a lot of stories in there, right? And we need the stories. We can't just have the instruction manual. We can't be like Christ without an example. We don't just have Paul's letters. We've got the book of Acts. We've got the Gospels. We can't be a disciple with an instruction manual only. We need those heroes giving flesh to the bones. So what about David? What about David? I was chatting with Stan right before about his view of David, which I won't disclose right now. But David is both a reviled and a revered figure. And I'm sure if we polled, we could get different opinions on David right here in this chapel. David is probably the most fully drawn character in the Bible, the most fully drawn, complex, and portrayed character in the Bible. When you look at David's life, what do you think? I've had some students who really dislike David, and they've got some good reasons for it. But in recent decades, actually, scholarly books have been published that are also on that page. His negative character traits, we could say, or his flaws have been accentuated in scholarly writing over any positive quality traits, which they often try and actually explain away as well. And this may be out to compensate against this kind of hagiography about David or naive views of him, that he was this ideal figure, and ignoring his negative traits. But I wonder if focusing wholly on David's negative traits and explaining away his positive traits is kind of similar to what's happening in our culture more broadly. I think I have a picture in the next slide. Heroes are falling, literally. Statues of heroes are being torn down. I think this is John A. MacDonald's head right there. The West heroes of the past are now being remembered, not for any positive contributions they did in their time or heroic attributes, but for the worst things they did, or maybe even what they thought. For example, in the wake of the riots following the death of George Floyd, there were assaults even on statues of Abraham Lincoln in the States, where they were tearing them down. In Boston, the authorities actually had to remove a statue of Lincoln and a freed slave from Square Park because of the outrage against him. So heroes and the search for transcendence. Well, I suggested earlier that maybe our attitude to heroes is part of this search for transcendence. Historically, of course, the search for transcendence has been through religion, generally, and through history. However, today it's often ideologies that are embraced to find some transcendence in our lives. Some suggest ideologies have taken over the role of religion in young people in the West. Many young people abandon church nowadays, but are flocking to radical political and social justice causes. Some might say there's a danger of confusing political beliefs and religious beliefs. And this happens on the right and the left. I have a friend whose kids go to my kids' school, and I was talking with them a little while ago, and he was so excited because my friend is very much against kind of left-wing ideologies. He gets really excited about it and trying to oppose them. And he met this mother of some kids at his school, who also was like this, who opposed some of the more radical left-wing thought. And he was telling me about it, and he was like, "Can you believe it? I think God's leading her to become a Christian," because she wasn't a Christian. For him, those were one and the same thing, though. If she was starting to go right-wing in her thinking, she must be almost becoming a Christian. And so we can mix up ideologies with faith. And this happens on the right and the left, too. And when this happens, an ideological agenda gets elevated to almost a transcendent level, where the moral high ground, this agenda becomes the moral high ground, almost beyond question, almost given a divine status. By ascribing to ideologies, you claim the moral high ground for yourself. So looking at heroes of the past, you see their flaws, and you're justified to vilify them, if not even just attack their statues or anyone who would defend them, as if your opinion was unassailable and you, without question, stand on the moral high ground above the supposedly disgraced icon. Maybe this explains some attitudes toward David. But the question could be asked, and I think I have a slide: was David a hero? Was David a hero? Going back to that book by Allison and Goethals, they write extensively about what they think are the 8 great traits of heroes. They say heroes are smart, strong, selfless, caring, charismatic, resilient, reliable, and inspiring. And I think in David's story, we can see these heroic traits. Just thinking of the David and Goliath story, he's smart. He walks out with a stick to distract him from carrying a sling, and he takes out Goliath when Goliath thought it was going to be hand-to-hand combat. That was kind of cunning and smart. He's strong. He fights Israel's enemies, the Philistines. He's caring. In chapter 23, he risks exposing himself when he goes to save the city of Keilah when Saul is actually attacking him. He protects God's priest, Abiathar. He's charismatic. Just look at his trash-talking speech to Goliath in chapter 17. His story is inspiring. Comes from being a shepherd boy to being the deliverer of Israel. He's reliable. He keeps covenant with Jonathan and his descendants. He's also famous for his inspiring songs. I know there's some controversy over which ones he actually wrote, but if any of them are attributed to him, he was inspirational in a lot of his ways and his passionate worship. I have this nephew out in BC, and my wife's sister's son, and he's 3 years old. His name's Cormac, he's a little kid. And I recently sent us a video, and he's running around pretending he's David. It's really cute. I thought about showing it, but his uncle's filming it, and he's going around saying, "I'm David. I'm fighting the Philistines." And his uncle's like, "No, you're not. You're a Philistine." He's like, "No, I'm not. Fight for Jesus." He says, "I'm a Jew. I'm David." So he's a little mixed up on some of the details. But what he learned in Sunday school about David was inspiring to him, this 3-year-old kid. And is that okay? Is it all right to teach kids that David is a hero? Well, I think it's biblical. We already had it mentioned in the Hall of Heroes. Thanks for reading from Hebrews there. He's mentioned there. But not only that, in the Old Testament, David becomes this archetype that every other king that comes after him is measured by. I think I have a slide on 2 Kings 16. It says this bad king was compared to him. He says he did not do what was right in the sight of the Lord his God, as his ancestor David had done. And keep in mind, the author here knows everything David did. Okay? It's not like the author was naive and only thought of the David and Goliath story. He knew David's life, but somehow David still is held up as an archetype. And that was important. So I suggest we need David, the hero, as well. We need heroes. People are seeking transcendence in their lives. They need meaning. They need a higher calling. And in many of David's stories, we see he demonstrates bravery, faith, kindness, a theological imagination that's worthy to be emulated. But you might say, kind of like Stan was saying, yeah, there's some good reasons to not look up to David too. He was lustful, he was vengeful, he was violent. And you'd be right. But for that reason, would you just look down on David? So for the rest of this talk, I want to go to that passage that was read by Ambrose in 2 Samuel 21. I'm not going to reread it, obviously, but just to think about our attitude towards heroes. And this confusion about heroes, I think, is seen today. In this story, there's this famine in Israel. When you think about that story that was just read, who has the moral high ground in the story? Is there a confusion between ideology and theology in this story? And who do we view as the hero? So there's this famine in Israel, and it's been going on for 3 years. David asks God what the problem is, and of course he gets word that it's to do with Saul. It's connected to Saul's slaughter of people from Gibeon. And this word from God seems to lead David to just think he solved the problem right there. But this word doesn't actually mean David is innocent in the chapter. David ignores self-reflection and thinks the problem lies wholly outside himself. But there's hints in the story he should have also looked at himself. In response to God's answer, the famine was due to Saul's slaughter. He brings the Gibeonites in. He asks them, what can we do to make this right? The Gibeonites, interestingly, start, well, we can't ask for gold or silver. Okay, and he says, and we can't ask for, or we can't kill anybody. And then David says, well, what do you want? And they say, well, we want to kill someone. And David goes with that one. It's interesting, he doesn't offer them silver and gold. That's how they started off. Can't ask for silver and gold. He says, oh, I'll give you silver and gold. But no, he doesn't. He goes right to, okay, let's kill those sons of Saul. So you might wonder why he jumped to that conclusion immediately. I suggest David is blind to his own agenda here. Killing the descendants of the previous king is the way to go when you take over in the ancient world. Regime change happens, usually you slaughter the descendants of the previous king. So him here slaughtering the Saulites kind of works in his favor. So David's looking to the external, Saul's sins here, but not looking at the internal, his own culpability. He has this high-minded criticism of others, which could blind him to his own culpability. So he identifies a problem. He figures out that's the solution, and he's all in. In that solution, he's not part of the problem. He's the moral one. But I think he has some dark, unexamined motives here. And I think we can do the same thing in our lives, where you identify a problem and it's not you. David's unexamined motives is killing Saul's descendants strengthens his throne. So there's a danger. We think that we're fighting against the external and we don't examine the internal. So religion and ideology are both dangerous if they convince you that all malevolence and ignorance lies outside of yourself. You don't have to look at yourself. You've got an enemy you can target. You have all the justification to go after them, and you have an unearned moral superiority. So I think perhaps this is what's happening with the tearing down of statues of our culture's heroes. You might have a slide for that. Yeah. We think we would have done better in their place. Maybe think we're their superiors. David here thinks the Gibeonites' bloody vengeance is the answer. I think that's another slide. But it's interesting, even after they're killed, the famine doesn't end. It doesn't actually achieve the goal that David thought it was going to do. It's interesting to me that this is told at the end of 2 Samuel. But most scholars think that the events actually took place earlier in the book. But telling it after the fact of David's many sins and failings, I think this underscores the fact that his judgment and his moral superiority that's on display here is based on the ignorance of the depths of his own sin. So this happens probably before his fall with Bathsheba and Uriah, but he's got this high-minded criticism. Unearned moral superiority. When I go out in the summer to visit my family in BC, often walk by a lot of homeless people. There's homeless people everywhere, I know, but it seems to me, at least where my parents live, there's just a ton of them. They have tent cities, a lot of them around. And I'm not proud of this, but sometimes when I walk by what appears to be a young man who's able-bodied sitting there on his phone with a sign asking for money, I think, if you weren't so useless, you could just get a job. Give me a break. You're begging for money. And maybe sometimes that's true. Maybe. But maybe if it weren't for the grace of God, that could be me. But sometimes I take on this moral superiority in the situation. So how should we read David? How should we read David? Well, I used to work on the streets in Vancouver when I was in a church out there, and we'd go down to Robson and Granville and try and tell people about Jesus on the streets. And I ran into this Muslim guy one time, and we started talking about the Quran, which I don't know much about, or didn't back then for sure. And he was telling me that in the Quran, David doesn't do any of the bad things that's in the Bible. And he says the Bible is clearly corrupted. It's maligning the saints. And he said to me, you would never do what David did. Think about it. The Bible is wrong. And at the time, I almost sounded like a compelling argument. I was like, yeah, I wouldn't do what David did. I wouldn't do that. Well, it's easy to be a David hater. Easy to point the finger at others and think, I would never do what David did. I might have a slide on that one. The high moral ground is claimed. I'm not like David. David was a terrible person. But we have to be cautious here, too, that we're not taking some kind of unearned moral superiority and viewing his failures. Instead, what's the lesson we can get out of this is, if I don't watch myself, if I don't rely on the Lord, I could do the things that David did. That's the lesson. They're not there to make you feel good about yourself, but to warn you. So what's the moral lesson of 2 Samuel 21? When we look at the story, who do you identify with? Rizpah clearly seems to be a hero in the story. The Gibeonites are victims, and they're demanding vengeance. And then there's David. Well, perhaps you're not Rizpah in the story. Perhaps you're David. Perhaps I'm David, and I better get a control of myself, or I could order the execution of my political rivals on the grounds I think I'm doing the right thing. In this story, you're the one who blames others for the current situation, and your actions are made to absolve yourself of guilt. But in the end, the continuation of the famine is your problem. Jump to the slide. I think I have verse 14. The famine actually doesn't end until David finally goes and buries the bodies of Jonathan and the Saulites. Jonathan, his best friend. In the end, it seems that something David needed to do, but he was ignoring anything to do with himself. Here we could realize that just hearing the voice of victims doesn't automatically give you the high ground. He was listening to the Gibeonites, who were victims of Saulite bloodshed. But David thought he was absolved of guilt and was happily moved to execute the Saulites. Many people who talk about justice really mean revenge. I think we could see that in this story. And the same can go today sometimes. Calls for justice can really be calls for revenge. And we have to be aware of our self-interest, our capacity for self-deception. So seeking transcendence. And I'll wrap this up. I've talked about seeking transcendence as looking for meaning in life, something more out of life than just the physical. How will your life count beyond physical existence? Who do you want to be? Well, I think heroes are important as we think about who we want to be. Heroes model exemplary behavior, challenge us to rise to their level. They inspire us to aim higher. Their heroic actions can remind you that everybody has potential to be a hero. Sometimes I think the church doesn't demand enough of young people nowadays and believers, or scare them enough. David's story, I think, can serve both ends. It can inspire us towards heroic actions, and his sins can scare us to realize our potential for similar failures. And we need to be aware of our potential. We're more dangerous, but also more promising than you might realize. We have a divine calling and ethical requirement to discipline ourselves, turn our lives into something. God depends on it. It's not a trivial matter to take yourself seriously. That's why we need heroes to emulate. We need to be like David in bravery, self-sacrifice, kindness, and worship. Christian life's not just feel-good theology, but it is discipline. Just to jump into a New Testament verse so that Jim could use his New Testament, he told me he brought in Greek. I beat my body and make it a slave, so after I preach to others, I will not be disqualified for the prize. MDC community, let's get ourselves together. Everything depends on you. Get yourself together. Your decisions are important. But we also have to be aware of our own flaws, our capacity for self-deception and fooling ourselves like David did in this story. So how can we move towards transcendence? Well, you might say, I can't do what David did. I can't be a hero. I haven't been strong in my life. I haven't been resilient. I've ruined relationships or been selfish, blown opportunities. Well, who hasn't? Welcome to the club. That's being human. And David was like that. He was a real character. He was human, if nothing else, we can see in his portrayal in the Bible. But despite David's failures, amazingly, he becomes this type of the Messiah and gets remembered for that. And I think that's amazing, despite all that the Bible says about him. David's legacy depends on God's grace. And it's the same with us. Our legacy, our meaning in life depends on God's grace. It's not just up to us. In the end, it's through God's grace that we can be heroes. And I think the fact the Bible highlights the success and failures of characters in the Bible is a reason to be encouraged, because it shows God works through flawed people. The son of David, Jesus, succeeded where David failed. And because of his success, we can succeed too. God's grace is in control of our legacy. Our salvation and success are based on God's grace, but it doesn't mean that we don't discipline ourselves. So who do you want to be? By God's grace, I want to be a hero.